Also, a region-wide deal for the almost dozen Pacific islands. China proposes an action plan to include a free trade area, but at least one island nation has pushed back the idea.
For more, Dr. Chong Ja Ian joins us live now. Dr. Chong is an associate professor at the National University of Singapore's Department of Political Science. Good evening, Dr. Chong. China's intentions are what are in question here. Is it even likely that all of these Pacific Island nations are going to sign such a deal?
So we actually don't know. I mean, so far we've seen the FSM indicate, this is the Federated States of Micronesia, indicate that they weren't particularly happy with the draft of the communique that was launched. And it's a draft, so there's a possibility that the language will still change. There's a possibility that other states, after scrutinizing the draft and having talks, may disagree. So, I mean, it's still up in the air right now.
And be that as it may, Dr. Chong, the contention seems to be that such a deal might impact the sovereignty of the Pacific Island nations. Let's just assume that they all did come to a consensus, that they do sign such a deal. How would they balance relations with China on one side and Australia, perhaps other Western nations, the United States on the other?
So one of the things that China seems to be offering, as you had mentioned, is this trade deal. A lot of these South Pacific nations, they've been looking to develop the economy, especially in the wake of COVID, where a lot of tourism has stopped. So that's seriously a concern. The traditional partnerships they've had with Australia, with New Zealand, with the United States, they seem to feel that they're not really getting that much out of those sorts of arrangements. So in this regard, one thing we could possibly see is that they could turn around and say, well, okay, can the US and Australia and others offer more? So there might be some competitive bidding that we see going on. On the other is maybe they find that China's deal is so attractive, they don't need to do very much else. Now, of course, there are other things that attack the deal, such as policing, cybersecurity, and I mean, this gets to the sovereignty issue that you mentioned, whether this means to say that China has effectively some sort of oversight over what they do, over how policing is implemented, over the sorts of domestic security issues. All this is still very much up in the air. There's a potential risk there, obviously, which I think is what is raising alarm about the current deal. But we'll have to see how things pan out. We'll have to see whether, even if something is signed, whether there's reneging later on. So, I mean, there's still a lot of moving pieces.
You mentioned the historical relationship between Australia and New Zealand as an example, how deep that has been with the Pacific Island nations. And they certainly, it goes back a long time. It is significant. Australia's already responded to the idea of such a deal. It says, OK, China's intentions might be clear, but they also want to be a regional partner of choice. And they do have that history with the area. Is that going to make a difference, the historic relations between Australia, as an example, and other countries, as opposed to what China's plan might be about?
So those historical relations, they may cut two ways. On the one hand, there's familiarity, but on the other, I think there have been Pacific nations who feel that they've been neglected by their traditional partners. They feel that there's not that much more to get out of those relationships, so they're trying to explore some new alternatives, such as China. But the real risk here is, even if we get into some sort of bidding for influence, what we could see then is different actors supporting different domestic partners. And that can mean that the domestic politics takes on a newer, more competitive element. We've seen this previously with China and Taiwan's competition for support in Papua New Guinea. That can prove highly destabilizing for those polities. So, I mean, that's one thing to watch. To have that bidding war for influence going on may not actually be a good thing.
Dr. Chong, thank you very much for that. That was Associate Professor Chong Ja Ian from the National University of Singapore.